As our right honourable overlords pack their bags and go on holiday, we at Novara Media are going nowhere. And today I'm delighted to be joined by the one and only Grace Blakeley, author, economist, Novara Media columnist, and top purveyor of parliamentary gossip, and more recently the political theories of Chantal Mouffe and Antonio Gramsci. A transformation that's earned you the meme of woke George Eaton. It's George Eaton, political editor of The New Statesman.
Thank you.
Thank you both for coming. Well, you were aware of woke George Eaton on Twitter.
Yeah.
What do you think about it?
I'm cool with that. Yeah.
It's
I've been
cool,
called
right?
worse things. It's
I think it's a positive.
I'll take it. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
No, love it.
We are going to be talking about Corbyn's Build It in Britain speech a bit later, and whether it has anything to do with Trumpism because of its protectionist overtones. But first things first, will Brexit survive the summer? We're going to start by looking at a Sky News poll today. So we can get that up, Gary. So it looks for the first time like public support for Brexit is seriously wavering. 78% think the government is doing a bad job of negotiating Brexit. 74% are dissatisfied with May. 42% think Brexit will have a negative effect on them personally, which compares to only 31% who think it will be positive. 50% think there should be a referendum on the final deal, compared to 40% who don't. It's only very recently that support for a second referendum has overtaken opposition to one. 51% think Brexit will be bad for the country overall. Only 40% think it will be good. And 65% think the government will get a bad deal. George, we're going to start with you. We should be leaving the EU in March 2019. That's only 7 months from now. Given these figures, given the weakness of May, is it even going to happen?
I think it will, but I think the chance of no Brexit is increasing because the Tories, Theresa May is struggling to find a deal. This was always going to be the case, especially with no majority, which can keep the Brexiteers on side, Tory MPs, which the EU will sign up to, because of course you've got to get the approval of all member states, which Parliament will pass. And there is no cost-free option. The UK essentially faces a choice where you either depart economically and that you pay an economic price for that, or you pay a political price in that you go for some sort of soft Brexit, but you become a rule taker rather than a rule maker.
I want to know about the parliamentary maths. So we often allude to this on Novara Media, but I know that you know a lot more than we do. So if May comes back in October or November, how do the numbers stack up? Do you think there's any chance that she can pass the soft Brexit deal she gets? Or do you see that being the crunch moment where she's probably going to fall, or we're going to see some radical transformation of what British politics looks like at that point?
So I think there's still a chance that she'll get a deal through, simply because, as we've seen, the so-called Tory rebels often don't rebel. But the problem the Tories and Theresa May have is that a lot of Labour MPs are going to vote against the deal automatically. The tactic is to try and bring her down, to try and get an early general election. And Theresa May has not done much to curry favour with Remainers, so they're not going to bail her out. She's also alienating the hard Brexiteers, the sort of Jacob Rees-Mogg wing of the Tory party. And so if you've got those two groups voting against the deal, it seems very, very hard to get it through, particularly because she's going to have to make further concessions to the EU if she wants them to sign up to it. So that leads you to a potential crisis. And in that moment, you could leave with no deal. I don't think that's likely, but certainly possible. Or you could see no Brexit.
And what about Boris Johnson? Can you imagine him swallowing his pride and voting for something that looks like the Chequers deal? And David Davis? Or do you think they are now really the characters that are going to throw a spanner in the works for whatever Theresa May is trying to do?
I think for Boris Johnson, the only viable strategy now is to oppose whatever Theresa May does on Brexit. He has to rebuild his credibility with Leave voters, and he needs to essentially go out and campaign against Theresa May's deal and overshadow Jacob Rees-Mogg, who has emerged as the new darling of the Tory Brexiteers.
Do you buy that?
Rees-Mogg?
Yeah.
The problem Rees-Mogg has is the grassroots members love him, but to get on the ballot, to make the final two in the Tory leadership race, you need support of more than 100 MPs, more than 150. He's not near that figure.
Grace, You came on the show on your birthday. Thanks for that.
No worries.
It was a delightful experience.
It was super fun. We had Prosecco and strawberries afterwards.
Yeah, it was very
great.
nice, wasn't it? To argue against a second referendum.
Yes.
Are you upset that the public have turned against you?
I still think that if there was a second referendum now, we would get people voting for hard Brexit. And I think that that's largely because referenda are these like huge divisive issues that kind of polarize people along a single issue. And obviously the Brexit referendum originally ended up being kind of elites versus everyone else after, wage stagnation, low economic growth and years of austerity. And to think that after, a decade of wage stagnation, after people's incomes have been massively eroded, after, they've seen the kind of decimation of services, of communities, of all these things, that there wouldn't be the same sort of momentum behind a kind of anti-elitist campaign is, I think, slightly naive, because you've got to remember the huge lead that Remain had before the last referendum. And there's actually a study that came out today that shows that the austerity caused Brexit was the kind of clickbaity headline, but it was kind of a series of regressions that showed that the extent to which you'd been impacted by austerity was positively correlated with the likelihood that you're going to vote for Brexit. And I think there's a couple of different things that underlie that, but ultimately a large part of that is the kind of mobilization of a big anti-elitist movement that I think people like Rees-Mogg and Johnson, even though they are the elite, were quite good at doing.
If May loses that vote in, say, like November, October, what would be the outcome? Do you see her going to the country for a referendum to try and get a mandate for what she wants to do? Do you see a new Tory leader?
You could well have a new Tory leader then, because I think that's a sort of event which most prime ministers in normal times don't come back from. That this is now her defining task as prime minister. A second referendum support's creeping up, although I don't think it's at the level for Remainers need. I think a lot of them hoped and in some ways expected to be polling in the 60s or even 70s by now. It's still roughly 50-50, a good poll maybe 55-45. And of course, Parliament would need to pass legislation for a second referendum. Now, it's hard to see them agreeing on a Brexit deal, but it's very hard to see them agreeing the terms of renew votes. And I can't see how May could propose a second referendum and survive as Tory leader. So perhaps an early general election is more likely. But of course, Tory MPs, as you'll know, including Remainers, are terrified of an early election because they started the last election 20 points ahead of Labour and blew that lead. If they start neck and neck or even slightly behind Labour in some recent polls, what are their chances? And they are terrified of a Jeremy Corbyn-led government in a way they were not terrified, say, of Tony Blair coming to power in 97. There were even some Tories then who thought, look, we've been in power 18 years, we're decaying, maybe a good spell in opposition is what we need. And some of them were so...
If we're going to hand it over to anyone, it might as well be him.
A lot of them would see the Thatcher line that she saw New Labour as her greatest achievement because they had to accept the fundamentals. And they loathed John Major so much that was their main focus. All the headbangers, who are now, of course, leading the charge for the hardest of Brexits.
Grace, do you buy the whole Mad Max idea of what a no-deal Brexit would look like? I mean, you're often talking about the injustices or the way that the European Union doesn't function right now. The single market is not really something to aspire to. Do you think if we do play hardball and leave with a no-deal in March, we will actually have the M26 closed for lorries and there'll be helicopters flying insulin around the country?
I mean, a no-deal Brexit would be pretty bad, right? You would have, and I mean, there are so many ways that we don't even know what it would look like. So yeah, if it was literally just like a sudden cessation of trade because people on the borders didn't know what they were supposed to be letting through, what the new regulations were, if it was literally a kind of, immediate crash out, that would have really negative immediate implications. It would create a kind of serious crisis, but also the kind of shorter term and medium term economic implications would obviously be very bad. We are currently a country that is highly dependent on imports. We would probably see another massive devaluation of our currency, which would make our imports more expensive, which would push up inflation even more. We've just seen some data come out from the ONS that shows that households, for the first time in 30 years, are now, their outgoings exceed their incomings. And a large part of that is because of the increase in cost push inflation, which is inflation driven by rising prices, since the devaluation of sterling. So again, all those sorts of things would immediately, over the short term, and especially if there wasn't a kind of left-wing government that was willing to kind of spend more to get the economy going, would have a severe economic impact. So yeah, we shouldn't be aiming or lobbying for a no-deal Brexit.
So what are we lobbying for?
We are lobbying for a hard Brexit, but a managed Brexit, I would say. I mean, and this is what, this is
Hard
my
and
argument.
managed.
I say we.
I like it.
So, I mean, the broad argument would be that you would want to get to a situation where, and this relates to Jeremy Corbyn's Build It in Britain speech, right? Where you were able to exit the single market, and therefore you wouldn't be subject to the four freedoms. So freedom of movement, freedom of capital, and freedom of goods and services, which would, immediately, if you hadn't built up a kind of base of domestic industry, would lead to much higher import prices. So ideally, we would want to be able to have a managed transition period where we'll be able to build up domestic industry, prepare, for basically becoming much more kind of self-reliant, and also potentially building up trade links with other places, as well as making the case for hard Brexit as kind of a way to extricate ourselves from the webs of international financial capital that led up to the financial crisis, and which actually ever since we left the EU have really been sucking capital out of the UK. It's really interesting to see the kind of statistics around mergers and acquisitions involving UK companies. Our companies now, because our pound has fallen, look very cheap to international capital. And 2016 was a record year for foreign companies buying UK companies. And of course, all the legislation that surrounds the single market is supposed to make it easier for European companies to be able to acquire British ones. So with those sorts of things, like limiting the ability of capital to kind of come in and flow out of the UK is a major reason why we should be potentially thinking about a hard Brexit. But obviously we can't do that immediately. We can't crash out. It would create a crisis.
What does the managed bit mean? So what is, I want to know very practically, what is a hard managed Brexit? How would it work?
I feel like
I'm sorry to put you on the spot there. But
yeah, it's fine. Okay, so I mean, if we were say we had a
I think
Labour
the audience will understand that I haven't prepped Grace for this question. So if a person cannot explain exactly the step-by-step process to having a hard managed Brexit, it doesn't mean you're still not the leading thinker of left-wing economics.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, I mean, I haven't prepared this, but in my view, it would look something like. I mean, you would have to have. And again, this is only something that really a left government would do. So in many ways, it's kind of a moot point, because we're not going to get a left government probably during the transition period unless we do have an early general election. But if that was to happen, then we would need to immediately implement what Corbyn was talking about the other day. So a kind of green industrial strategy that would involve boosting Britain's industrial base and its exporters, particularly in the parts of the country that have been most kind of maligned by the last 40 years of financialization and globalization. So that would mean building up, providing government support, whether in the form of finance or of kind of various forms of breaks or subsidies, all these sorts of things to industries that we want to support. So they would mainly be kind of quaternary industries, knowledge-based industries, service-based industries that would be able to manufacture goods that could both be produced in the UK and exported. You'd also have to make sure that escalated down supply chains. So at the moment, a big problem we have with our manufacturing is that it relies too much on imports. So any devaluation immediately gets passed on to the cost of the final produced good. So you would have to invest in the creation of kind of industrial clusters, whereby you get kind of specialisms in particular areas. So, Germany's very good at this. Even somewhere like Switzerland is very good at this. Even though that we'd be looking at a similar situation with a very heavily financialized economy, from which we're trying to be kind of boost industry. So, yeah, and obviously that would have to be also, you'd have to look at making it green. So it would be manufacturing things that would go into renewables, kind of building out green infrastructure, all that sort of stuff.
But
and that would
Brexit specifically, we're just playing hardball on state aid, right? So
yeah.
it's sort of like we're fine with free trade within the EU. It's just we want to get a massive opt-out on.
The reason that you might want to argue for hard Brexit, the reason I would want to argue for hard Brexit is, I mean, it's partly the state aid rules. It's not massively the state aid rules because, the European law is not law. like international law is a social construct, right? So, you know, the way in which it's enforced, the precedent all depends on kind of existing power relations. So there's a debate as to the extent to which it's actually ever illegal for Britain to do any of the things that the EU kind of doesn't think we should do. The main thing is whether or not you can impose restrictions on the movement of capital in and out of the country and within the country. So can you direct capital to the extent to which a Labour government would want to direct capital? And could you place restrictions on the ability of capital to leave? Which and to enter, of course. And that, you know, like restricting capital mobility is part of a wider process, managed hard Brexit, whereby we would have to kind of try and move economic activity away from our current situation, which is financial and business services, towards the production and export of goods of one kind or another.
All right, we're going to move on to these deeper Corbynite economic questions.
Cool.
Slightly later, after we watch a little bit of his speech. First of all, George, are either of the parties going to split? I mean, the story we've told so far, it looks pretty difficult how it's going to go well for Theresa May or the Tories. She looks like she's either going to potentially lose a vote in October and November, and she'll be replaced by someone who'll be in exactly the same bind, which is she's got a bunch of hard Brexiteer backbenchers who are willing to blow up her Brexit plan, but no parliamentary majority in favour of a hard Brexit. So it looks like Labour could swoop in and win an election if one is forced. But do you think they will split before that happens? There's been lots of talk that about 20 of them are going to leave the party and form either a new centrist party or just start sitting on their own. Your colleague Stephen Bush was writing about this on the weekend. What do you think? Do you buy it?
I think believe it when we see it, because Labour MPs have been threatening to quit the party since 12th of September 2015, when Jeremy Corbyn was elected Labour leader. There hasn't been a breakaway yet. And of course, the incentives against it are strong. Most MPs, if you look at the numbers, do get elected on the basis of the party brand, not on their personal vote. Most MPs who break away from the party, stand as an independent, don't get re-elected. A lot of Labour MPs who are very hostile to Corbyn are also quite tribal. They still see Labour as their party, you know, particularly the old right at the party, so the Tom Watson wing. And they think that we'll fight and fight to change Labour from within. And of course, under first past the post, it's very hard for new parties to make progress. So I don't think you can discount the possibility of a Labour or a Tory split, particularly a Tory split. I mean, if Jacob Rees-Mogg became leader, I think you would have a Tory split, simply because you've got a fundamental clash then of different visions.
But you'd have exactly the same issue, right? You'd have the same issue that there's a bunch of backbenchers who aren't interested in the direction of the party, but they know that they're going to lose if they split. So for self-interested reasons, it's better to wreck from the backbenchers than to form your own formation. Potentially,
although I think Remainers do look to the example of, say, UKIP. So UKIP never had more than 2 MPs, but it had it acted as essentially the most powerful pressure group in the country, was a big factor in pushing David Cameron towards allowing an EU referendum. And a Remain equivalent now, say, could force a future Prime Minister to hold a referendum on re-entry to the EU or joining the EEA. You can come up with different permutations. I think that would be the strategy. But I think almost centrists have played a bad game in that they've talked up, they've been throwing all these terrible names for centrist parties around, you know, back together. You've even had some which sounds, as someone put it to me, like a bad Take That tribute act. You've had some centrist parties which have been founded which have sort of disappeared without trace. And actually that's getting it the wrong way around. First you need to come up with the ideas, that what would an exciting centrist programme look like? That's, you know, answer that question first before you start saying, oh, what are we going to call it? Who's going to be leader?
Chaka.
That speaks to everything about centrism, doesn't it? The idea that actually firstly, exciting ideas-based centrist platform is an oxymoron. Yeah. And secondly, the obsession with the branding and the name and the faces is just so, like, you know, the history of our politics over the last 40 years, where there hasn't been any real debate on the substance of economics or really anything remotely interesting. It's just been a kind of battle of different, variously made up and, you know,
I want them to leave. I really want them to leave. I think there's 20 people who should leave the Labour Party who are currently MPs, because if we win an election with them as part of the party, they will break away when we're trying to do some significant leftist policies, And we want them to go now so they can lose the next fucking election, because they will lose it. And I think the only reason they're staying there is because they know they can have more influence as wreckers within the Labour Party than they would if they went it alone and had to argue for what they actually think instead of just against Jeremy Corbyn, because they don't have any social base. So I want them to go.
They should be accountable to their CLPs. They really should. And I mean, everything that's going on at the moment with the Democracy Review, like, we don't know what's actually going to happen in terms of trigger ballots or reselection or anything. But that is how, the internal democracy of the Labour Party should work. If these people are threatening to leave, they should be removed by the people to whom they're supposed to be accountable.
I agree. I mean, the Democracy Review isn't going to deal with any questions of how to select MPs, so I think that is going to have to be pushed from the bottom up, because everyone's at the top is worried it'll be too explosive. Although I think at this point, support for mandatory reselection from the leadership, when you've got people going on the radio saying they still don't back Tony Blair. No, they do back Tony Blair to be Prime Minister. They don't back Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister. I think something's got to change soon. You do, and you don't even need mandatory reselection. All you need is the reduction in the kind of, increasing ease with which you're able to launch a trigger ballot, because it's incredibly difficult. You have to spend a lot of time organising, and a lot of people are. Are you in favour of mandatory selection? You don't normally give your opinions, do you, in your pieces? You're more you're. I
think on an issue, I think I'll. It depends on the terms, but I think, look, if you are a local MP, clearly one of the things you have to have is a good relationship with your CLP, and I think people would make the distinction between MPs who are generally good local representatives, who it's fine to dissent on some issues, but I think when you do have fundamental differences, then inevitably the question is going to come up from party members. Are you still in the right party, and can we have confidence in you? I think it's very helpful on this issue from a left perspective that the first big battles are over Brexit, not over whether you like Jeremy Corbyn or not. Because, of course, the Remainers, the hard Remainers on the Labour benches like Chukwuemeka, Chris Leslie, they're not going to go to bat for Kate Hoey and Frank Field. Yeah. So
it's brilliant. Vauxhall is kind of the most right-wing CLP in the country, so we're going to have Progress do the first reselection of the Corbyn era, which I think is fabulous. So they're better organised than us. How come they got to do it first?
So anyway, once if then they'll be asked in the future, if you do have, say, someone says, should we deselect Chris Leslie? Well, then people will say, well, look, you might not like that. Where were you when
everyone's going to like that? Come on.
Where were you when they were trying to deselect deselected Kate Hoey? So there's a sort of double standard issue for the anti-Corbynites.
All right, we're going to go to Build It in Britain, and a kind of morning of fake news. We always like to call it out when it happens. Can we get the video up, Gary, of Jeremy Corbyn last week giving his speech about his vision for the British economy after Brexit? That should be coming up now.
While the Conservatives are continuing, as they always have done, kowtowing and skewing policy to the narrowest interests of the City of London, while ignoring the needs of the vast majority in their bungled Brexit negotiations. Labour is setting out a genuinely new economic direction for our country. Now is the time to put people's jobs first and living standards first. That's why Labour is launching this campaign today here in Birmingham, because we want to see well-paid jobs in the industries of the future. Our new economic approach is necessary because for the last 40 years, a kind of magical thinking has dominated the way Britain is run. We've been told that it's good, even advanced for our country, to manufacture less and rely instead on cheap labour abroad to produce imports, while we focus on the City of London and the financial sector. A lack of support for manufacturing industry is sucking the dynamism out of our economy. We, in the Labour Party, are committed to turning things round. That's why we'll build things here again.
Are we back? Maybe. Great. I still find it funny watching those political speeches on TV, because if you're there in the room, you realise they've got two, what are they called? Auto cues. They've got two auto cues, one on the right and one on the left. And every 2 sentences they have to change auto cue.
Oh my God.
And that makes it look like they're not reading. But Corbyn he's got much better at it, but he's still not that good at it. So you can sort of see him squinting. So he's sort of going like...
That's hilarious. I also just noticed how many like old white men there were in that audience. That just like speaks to the caliber of economics journalism in this country.
There was quite a sweet tweet after that speech that it was... One of the economic journalists had sort of tweeted out that it was the first press conference they'd been to, or the first political speech where there was a baby in the audience.
Oh, that's nice.
And then obviously, Jeremy Corbyn was like nice and granddadly to it afterwards. But I mean, we all talk enough about how he's quite a nice granddad, so we won't do that right now. The speech was subject to some pretty outlandish reporting afterwards, so we're going to get up the Independent's splash on this story from that morning. They went with Jeremy Corbyn to highlight economic benefit of Brexit as he demands UK stop relying on cheap labour from abroad. That prompted tweets from Michael Deacon, who said, "Can't believe UKIP have got a new leader." That was picked up by Nicola Sturgeon, who said that Corbyn is peddling falsehoods about migrants, and this is what we expect from Tories and UKIP. Profoundly depressing for the Labour leader to be at it too. And our honourable Labour backbenchers were straight on the phone to Jim Pickard to say Labour can't address people's fears on immigration by peddling falsehoods about migrants and aping the policy of Donald Trump. Caroline Lucas got in there as well to have a diss. I can't remember what she said. Grace, it wasn't actually an anti-immigrant speech, was it? So the idea was they were importing cheap labour via imports. They were importing imports made by cheap labour, but it wasn't about migrants at all.
Which is, it's kind of, there's this bizarre thing whereby everyone suddenly started saying this was like an anti-immigrant tirade, when what he'd said was, and I mean that you can question the use of the phrasing, but what he'd said was that the imports that the UK uses rely on cheap labour from abroad, which is just obviously true, because the whole reason that we had, our manufacturing industry was basically decimated in the end of the 70s towards the 80s was because manufacturers left to seek out cheap labour that they could exploit much easier than they could exploit the unionised labour in the UK. And then our economy moved from producing things to importing things made by people who were not only paid less but existing in horrifyingly awful working conditions. Your iPhone and our Macs would have been made by people who working every day non-stop in Foxconn and killing themselves. And the coltan inside the computers that we're using will be from war zones in Central Africa and all this sort of stuff. This is, the point that he's making is that globalization relies on supply chains that are fraught with exploitation that we just don't see because it's not right in front of our faces. And that was, of course, the great coup of the 70s and 80s, is that we kind of have rising living standards here premised upon accelerated exploitation everywhere else, and think, oh, isn't capitalism great?
That's what we all think. George, a bunch of people got quite a hard time about printing this fake news. Who was the Independent? What's he called?
Ben Kentish.
Yeah, you've outed him. I mean, other people in defence, or they in defence of themselves sort of said, well, even if it was ambiguous, even if we misinterpreted it, the speech was written to be designed to be misinterpreted as anti-migrant, and then because it wasn't anti-migrant, that gave us a level of plausible deniability. Who do you think is at fault here?
I think the journalists in that. I think it's very easy to now bracket anything that's mildly interventionist as Trumpian, protectionist, when there's a vast difference between a nationalist president who is using these economic tools essentially for quite crude nationalistic ends and developing an industrial strategy, which actually has been a topic on the centre left within Labour since Peter Mandelson was as business secretary. That's sort of when they started talking about industrial strategy again. And yet sometimes when Jeremy Corbyn actually poses things which are really quite commonsensical, they get painted as incredibly radical and dangerous. I think what Corbyn grasps, which I think has been a problem for the Conservatives, is that Brexit is a natural moment to step back and say, well, how should we structure the British economy? What are we taking back control for? I think the problem Theresa May's had is that often she's spoken of Brexit as if it's a technocratic exercise. Now, actually, when she first became Prime Minister, she was talking a bit about industrial strategy, about breaking with free market Thatcherism. Now, the problem was always translating that into hard policy, and she floated ideas like workers on boards and then retreated from that. And then after the election, she completely retreated from that. And now there's a big hole, a big gap where the Tories' economic agenda should be. And for Labour, I think you see a great opportunity here, which is if Brexit happens in March 2019, that Britain's left the EU, but that doesn't answer the question of what you want the country to look like and how you want the economy to be run. And that's an opportunity for Labour to say we've got an alternative programme here, which actually commands broad support on the left and within the party. And the Conservatives are busy fighting the latest round of their civil war.
So your man at The Independent obviously misinterpreted the speech and wrote a headline way too soon. Either incompetence or malice. We'll let you decide. But someone who did read the speech did still critique it. So Ben Chu in The Independent, this was slightly later in the day.
Yeah.
He says, the implication that the UK would benefit from churning out manufactured products domestically that are currently made in the developing world is nonsense. So he's saying, even when you interpret the speech correctly, this idea that we have outsourced jobs to the developing world because they're cheaper and we want to bring back these kinds of manufacturing jobs to the UK, he's saying that's nonsense. What do you think?
So I think two things. The types of manufactured goods that we currently import, I mean, basically we now import pretty much everything that we consume. The only things that we export are financial services, weapons, pharmaceuticals to an extent, certain industries that have actually been receiving industrial strategies from the state for a very long time. But essentially most of the other stuff that we consume, we import. And some of that is kind of low value stuff, stuff from Primark, which is obviously premised upon massive amounts of exploitation. And some of it is kind of higher value stuff. Some of it's imports for the stuff that we do produce. And I think you need to think about all those different things in different ways. So firstly, when you're thinking about, you look back to kind of outsourcing and the original impetus behind outsourcing, it was very much cheap labour, as cheap as you could possibly find it, to do very low skilled work and kind of make the stuff that you get from Primark, etc., etc. Increasingly, that model is becoming less and less sustainable. I mean, it's particularly unsustainable in China because of rising wages. And of course, this kind of model of capitalist development where you, chase low wages eventually reaches the point at which there are no longer any low wages to chase. So a lot of the stuff that used to be produced in China is now being produced in Bangladesh or other parts of Southeast Asia. And combined with that, the kind of both the environmental imperative and potentially increasing transport costs mean that model is less and less sustainable. So there is a case for actually saying that we can and should be producing more of these things here. Now, the other side to that equation is that a lot of that can now be automated. So there is a case for saying that we can reshore a lot of the stuff, and rather than relying on extremely cheap labour in the UK, which obviously wouldn't be sustainable, or paying people extremely high wages, which would raise the price of those goods, we can automate a lot of this stuff ourselves. This isn't to say, by the way, at any point that we're ever going to be able to completely not rely on imports. The idea is just that we're able to produce enough stuff here to kind of reduce our environmental impact on the rest of the world, and also to be able to pay our way in the world. Because, and this comes back to the second point about us being able to kind of manufacture high value manufactured goods and also have the supply chains for the manufacturing of those goods in the UK, is that what people don't talk about when they talk about the kind of fiscal deficit, they don't talk about the current account deficit. And both are actually different forms of borrowing. So the fiscal deficit is government borrowing to pay for spending. The current account involves borrowing from the rest of the world in one form or another. And what we've done over the last kind of 40 years is buy lots of things to the rest of the world and borrowed a huge amount of money that's flowed into our banks and our financial system. And those capital inflows have propped up our currency, have flowed into assets like housing, and also all the kind of debt obligations that were built the debt securities that were built off the back of that housing. And obviously that model ended in 2007 and was completely unsustainable. And as I said earlier, since then, we've been kind of relying on selling everything that we have. So selling British companies, selling companies abroad, various sorts of, and obviously our currency's devalued, and we're selling a lot more government debt as well. So moving towards a situation in which we are both relying more on kind of automated manufacturing production here, as well as high value manufacturing for export, is, I think, not only necessary from an environmental perspective, it's also necessary for a Britain that wants to be able to kind of pay its way in the world.
So we were talking earlier about a provocative paragraph from Paul Mason at one of the end of his articles, which was about reshoring manufacturing in Britain and creating sort of high-skilled jobs reducing our dependence on imports of goods. And he said that he thinks it is necessary to reindustrialise Britain, even if that means that you get slower growth in the global south. It was very controversial. Many people on Twitter called him a racist, which I think is slightly overblown from the paragraph that he had written. But it does make sense. So what you're saying is that we've run a current account deficit for a very long time. That basically means we're importing more than we're exporting. And to pay for that, we've had to sell all of our capital, or sell a lot of our crown jewels,
capital,
as it were.
Until, since the Brexit vote. Before that, we could rely on lots of capital coming in anyway, because it just went into our finance sector and borrowing and debt, essentially.
But what that practically means is a massive transfer of income and wealth from the global north to the global south, which, even though it's shit for British people,
it's actually the opposite.
Has created a transfer of wealth, no?
It's the opposite. Because we're relying on capital inflows from the rest of the world to finance our current account deficit.
But that makes them the creditors. So China are getting richer. Some of that they store in our banks. But Chinese people are getting richer from the wages that they earn as they make our TVs. And then sort of like the Chinese middle class are ending up with loads of UK government bonds. And capital returns, because obviously when you put capital into Britain, you get interest from it.
Yeah. So part of that has been capital that has been sucked out of the developing south, and some of which has gone into things like deposits, some of which has gone into less so before 2007, but increasingly since then it has gone into buying UK companies that can be that will produce income that will go out of the UK. But more than that, because we've had a very strong currency based on our large financial sector, we've been the ones, as well as the US, that have been buying a lot of kind of goods and buying a lot of companies and investing a lot in places in the global south. So a lot of the kind of manufacturing base of places like China and less so China because they've got a much larger state in the economy, but a lot of places like Southeast Asia, places like Africa are a lot of the companies that run there and that create the kind of the profits that are derived from industry in those places are often sucked out of those places to go to accrue to capitalists in the global north and also increasingly in China. So that kind of development strategy, whereby we've had the fleeing of multinational corporations from the global north in order to find cheap labor in the global south, has been kind of construed as foreign direct investment, which is a good thing. But of course, foreign investment in an economy means the extraction of future revenues from that economy, as we're going to be seeing when we have increasing foreign ownership of the companies on our own economy.
It seems like we've got a lot of consensus about Corbyn's Trumpian economic policy. Is it difficult? Is it different from Trump's economic policy? Do we also back his protectionism?
Well, I think on Trump's economic policy, what stands out for me is that actually he talked a big game during the campaign about investing in infrastructure. But actually, what's the main economic policy he's introduced so far? Huge tax cuts for the rich, which is complete Republican orthodoxy. It's one of the reasons why some of the Republicans who would object to a lot of his stances and offences backed him, because people like Paul Ryan were sort of salivating at all these huge tax cuts from a libertarian perspective. But actually, has he invested huge amounts in infrastructure? No. I mean, he's sort of supercharged the US economy with these tax cuts, and so you've seen stock markets booming. But is this actually benefiting the Rust Belt workers who he appealed to during the campaign? The jury is obviously out on that.
I mean, it seems this is almost a derive, like we're going to Trump. But I suppose we're talking about Trumpian economic policy, so we might as well talk about the real Trump's actual economic policy. It's quite interesting. The tax cuts seem to have gone quite well. People got a wage boost, at least briefly. It got passed on to workers. He started a trade war, which I think is benefiting some of the steel manufacturers, but was going to screw over the soybean growers. But then he's just transferred them shed loads of money. Do you think Trumpian economics is going to work?
I mean, to what extent is Trumpian economics based on a kind of coherent analysis of even the American economy, let alone the global economy?
Make America great again, build it in Britain.
It seems to just be a kind of series of ad hoc measures that combine economic nationalism with actual nationalism and neoliberalism, tax cuts and all these sorts of things. So, and the American economy has deep structural problems that Trump is definitively not going to resolve by kind of ad hoc measures here and there, whether it's tariffs or, the alleged massive infrastructure investment plan that, doesn't seem to be happening. I just don't think that there is any such thing as Trumpian economics.
We're going to take questions in a second. First of all, Aaron Bastani, co-founder of Novara Media, has asked, should the IEA, Institute for Economic Affairs, be sent to prison?
When are they going to prison?
When are they going to prison? George? When is Kate Andrews from the Institute for Economic Affairs going to prison?
For intellectual bankruptcy.
Very good.
Good question. Actually, to some extent, I think this is telling us what we already know. I mean, part of the sort of guarding revelation was that the IEA are in the Brexit influencing game. I mean, a lot of this is entirely unsurprising, but it's worth making the point that these think tanks are incredibly opaque in their funding, and yet every time I turn on Question Time or another BBC political program, which is increasingly rare occurrence, someone from the Taxpayers Alliance or the IEA is on there as presented as a general economics commentator rather than someone who's backing a very narrow and dogmatic form of right-wing economics, which actually, if you look at polling, is an astonishingly unpopular position in Britain. That actually the British public are divided on quite a lot of things, but one thing they're fairly united on is that they want a more social democratic economic policy. You look at the support for nationalisation, the support for taxing the rich, and yet these people are presented as general economic pundits. So I think that should end.
Yeah, so the story today was obviously that the Institute for Economic Affairs some people from Greenpeace went undercover and found that they were basically providing funders with access to politicians. And they appear regularly, as you say, on the BBC as independent economics experts. It's very clever to call yourself the Institute for Economics Affairs instead of the people obsessed with privatising the NHS, which as a name would give the game away. That would be a bit more honest. And to get invited back all over and over again on Question Time when there is no social support whatsoever for privatising the NHS. They recently came out with a report. No, they've come up with a competition to say, what should we do to land? But when Kate Andrews was on the Spectator podcast with Aaron, she said the housing crisis would be sorted if we just got rid of all regulations. And it's like, there's literally no economic analysis that makes that in any way justifiable. It's just bonkers. All right, your questions, come on. Is George Monbiot's book any good? I don't know. Has anyone read it?
I haven't read it
I think
yet.
it's behind your head, that's why.
Oh, which one?
There, Out of the Wreckage. I haven't read it either.
Didn't Trump give $12 billion in subsidies to the US steel industry?
Yeah, he did. He did give some subsidies to the steel industry. I don't know if it was 12 billion. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of part of his general protectionist agenda, isn't it? Whack a couple of tariffs here, randomly choose an industry to give to give subsidies to there. There was a graph the other day that showed, as a result of both tariffs and some of the subsidies, the industries that had benefited and jobs that had benefited versus those that had lost out. And it was like, steel, there has been some benefits, and in a number of other different industries in various different parts of the supply chain, there had been severe disbenefits.
All right. What is Norway Plus? So I suppose we want a little explanation there, but I'm also going to add to it. How happy would you be with that, Grace, our resident Lexit spokesperson, even if unwilling? And George, how acceptable do you think that would be to Westminster?
So Norway Plus would be... Norway is not... So it's a participant in the single market, isn't it? So it accepts all the... not only all of the four freedoms, but also all the kind of horizontal cross-cutting legislation around the single market. So about competition law, and it accepts the enforcement decisions of the ECJ and all those sorts of things. But it has a small opt-out, basically, for fishing, right?
As far as I can tell, it's a rule taker apart from fish.
Yeah, so that was the agreement, right, is that you would just basically get access to all of the benefits, but we'll give you a little, we'll sacrifice being able to make any decisions, and in return you can keep your fishing and stuff. So I mean, we wouldn't be able to have an exemption for one of the 4 freedoms. Like that.
Yeah, I
just
guess
simply
that is what
wouldn't
Norway
happen.
Plus means, right? I
Yeah.
guess that it's Norway's deal without so many of the downsides. I mean, I think it's hard to see how it would get through the Commons, because obviously that's precisely what the hard Tory Brexiters don't want. And then on Labour, you've got some MPs from Leave voting constituencies, Caroline Flint, sort of emblematic of this, who are worried about a soft Brexit because they don't like free movement. And then you've got those on the left who are worried about the economic conditions it might impose in terms of market restrictions and state aid. So that's quite a formidable coalition against. But there is a theory which is worth mentioning, which is that there's a belief that if whoever replaces Theresa May, if it's a Brexiteer, they could adopt a kind of Nixon goes to China strategy, where Britain has temporary EEA membership just so you've left. Because there are some Brexiteers who are genuinely worried Brexit might not happen now, who just want to get over the finishing line. And then you diverge over time. So you have a sort of Brexit 2.0 strategy where you sort everything out in the transition period. And that's the strategy that Michael Gove is pursuing from within the cabinet.
Oh, that's what Michael Gove wants, to stay in the EEA and...
Well, no, he doesn't, but I mean, I suppose... I mean, so interestingly, there are some... So I think Douglas Carswell, for instance, former UKIP, but he's backing this now. So I wouldn't be surprised if you do get a great clusterfuck in the autumn and the crisis, I wouldn't be surprised if you have more Brexiteers saying, screw it, let's just get in the EEA because...
And deal with the details later.
Yeah, we've got to get over the line.
That seems like the most likely option, doesn't it? Just that you get a coalition to back... A parliamentary coalition to back staying in the EEA and dealing with the consequences later. The Labour Party vote against it. 20 of the national government Labour Party people cross the floor and make their sort of like independent Labour Party, which they've formed for whatever reason they can find.
It's possible,
and then end up voting with May.
Ends
this
with a whimper
and we
rather
end
than a
up
bang,
5 years in the EEA, and then in 5 years' time potentially rejoin the EU.
It's possible.
Have I called it? Is that what's going to happen?
Could happen.
Right. This is an interesting question. I'm going to go to you, George, first. Which new Labour policies could be created to get more over 65 voters?
Yes, so actually, I think Labour needs to do a better job of selling its existing policies. So they've said they will protect all of the universal pension benefits.
Protect everything good.
We will shower you with cash. I mean, the Tories, they're hindered slightly by the Tories. I mean, you think will be smart enough not to make the mistake they did in 2017, where they basically, it was as if they said, what can we put in our manifesto that's really going to alienate our base? Let's cut winter fuel payments. Let's have the dementia tax. I mean, Labour needs to propose a solution on social care, which the government is still promising yet another green paper on. So they're absolutely failing to deliver on that. Labour needs to sell its NHS policy. Of course, elderly people rely on the NHS. And I think promotes actually the politics of generational solidarity. I'm not a fan of the millennials v boomers narrative, because I think it ignores the fact that actually the biggest divisions are still within generations rather than between them. So a poor millennial and a poor pensioner have more in common in class terms than an affluent pensioner and a pensioner who's struggling to heat her home. So I think Labour needs to do more of that and say, look, yes, we'll protect your benefits. We're also going to scrap tuition fees for your grandchildren, and so you won't have to worry about them leaving with debt. And we're going to create more good jobs, because I think a concern of an anxiety a lot of pensioners have is what jobs are there for the future generations to do, and they worry that the age of stable, decently paid work is fading.
That was the strangest thing about the last election, wasn't it? Because the Tories, I agree with you that we don't want to create a sort of like generation war. But the Tories, in their manifesto, sort of started one where they were like, old people have to start paying their way. Obviously, it was unfairly distributed, because it was if you got dementia, you had to pay your way. Yeah. But it was weird because it's like they didn't realise that they were never going to get young voters. All their voters were old, and they were like, screw you, old people. You've been screwing over the young people. It's mad. Well,
the generational divide is about housing, isn't it? It's about housing, and it's about wealth. A little bit private pensions wealth. You know, you had the Tory electoral strategy since the 80s has rested on expanding home ownership combined with asset price inflation, and also to an extent the privatisation of pension funds, which is also backed up by asset price inflation. And the moment that breaks down, i.e. in 2007, they have not thought of the new electoral coalition that they're able to build up, because constant asset price inflation is unsustainable because it leads to financial crises. And it also prevents their electoral strategy, which is the expansion of ownership to create these kind of mini capitalists that have a stake in the continuation of the status quo. And that has now led to the housing crisis. We've tried to kind of reflate asset values since the crash in 2007, and that's made, not boosted the economy and not particularly boosted the Tories' popularity. And it obviously hasn't helped solve the housing crisis either. So this kind of, realization that, the electoral base that we created for ourselves is dying, but also we can't, widen it out without reducing the value of the assets that they vote based on. So what do? They're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
I feel like the Tories in terms of housing have gone full circle. So obviously Margaret Thatcher's privatisation of council housing was a genius policy in that it created a load of Tory voters. So she quite correctly thought, how do we get people to be invested personally
and
into an economy which is based on asset prices instead of decent wages and decent labour conditions. And she was like, we'll make everyone homeowners, which for about 20 years, and you could say 40 years if you say it created neoliberal hegemony, but that's now starting to unravel because no one else can afford, a new generation can't afford to get onto the housing ladder because asset prices have gone so high.
And it wasn't just selling off the council houses.
I mean, she sold loads of shit, right?
It was also, you couldn't have had the boom in ownership and also asset prices if you just, privatised.
It was also like making mortgages much easier to give
banks.
out. Okay,
yeah, which provided both the expansion of ownership and the increase in asset prices, because you allow loads more people to get mortgages on much easier terms.
Yeah.
That then creates more money chasing effectively the same amount of stuff. House prices go up 10 times over 30 years. Doubled in rate of normal inflation.
That's a good point. So the property owning democracy wasn't just about privatising council homes. It was also about liberalising the mortgage market.
It's not even, the housing crisis is not predominantly about supply. It's about mortgages.
Yeah, which is why simply increasing supply is inadequate unless you overhaul the financial system
exactly.
too. And it reminds me actually, while we're on the subject of Thatcher, there's that Thatcher quote that the right love to use, that the problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money. The problem for Tories is that with capitalism, you eventually run out of other people's assets to privatise.
Yeah.
It's a one-off tactic that you sell these assets, you get a windfall. It helped the Tories when unemployment twice exceeded 3 million and they were having to pay for unemployment benefit. But what you create is then inadequate privatised industries and an inadequate housing market, which then leads voters to think, well, actually, what's the alternative now? In the same way that people did when you had inadequate, badly run nationalised industries in the 70s.
Total Walking 8 asks, will the anti-Semitism issue prevent Labour winning the election?
No, is the answer, in quite crude terms, because I don't think it's politically salient enough for the majority of voters to determine their vote. You're outside of an area, as you saw in the last local elections, Barnet, where it did hurt Labour. I suppose you could argue it might contribute indirectly if it does trigger some sort of breakaway, if the divisions do rumble on. But I'd be surprised if it's one of the major reasons why Labour could lose.
In terms of like the rumours that were circling around on the weekend, that's what I thought was the weird, because obviously there's 20 people in the Labour Party who are looking for a premise to break away, and if their premise was their party's going to have the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism written into their constitution as opposed to the NEC Code of Conduct on anti-Semitism, that's not really going to make a big dent in anyone's electoral coalition, is it? I mean, that's so technical. Do you have any strong opinions on whether the anti-Semitism scandal is going to affect Labour's chances?
Yeah, I have strong opinions about it because I just think, it's just really sad and awful. And I speak a lot to my Jewish friends about both the substance of what's happened and the way it's been reported. And I think the issue I have isn't like a political one, it's an electoral one. It's like the extent to which we actually have a handle on what the Jewish community's problems are with the way that not only kind of the anti-Semitism that does exist on the left, but also the way we've dealt with it. And I don't think that's primarily about Israel. I think it's primarily the kind of crazy, Zionist elite bankers control the world type stuff that we just kind of completely fail to deal with. But also, that we are unable to kind of have that conversation openly and honestly as a party amongst ourselves, because there are people that will cynically use it, the Margaret Hodges of this world, to try and undermine Jeremy Corbyn. So I mean, I agree. I don't think it's necessarily a massive political issue, but it's something that makes me really sad, that makes a lot of people on the left really sad, and that I know a lot of people are losing sleep over.
George, you talk to people on all sides of the party. What do you see any way out of this current row, or do you think it's just going to rumble on forever?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think it will probably take a big event to overtake it. I suppose in the autumn it is going to be all Brexit. I don't think, but it would be a pity if there wasn't some means of a reasonable agreement here, because I actually think most Labour MPs don't think Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite. Most people think he is well-intentioned on this.
It's pretty implausible, isn't it?
Yeah.
I always say, if you think about the concerns that people have about the IHRA definition, which is that people disagree on this, but the concern is that it will affect the freedom of speech of Palestinians to talk about their own oppression.
Yeah.
You look at the history of Jeremy Corbyn and the people around him, is the best explanation that he really cares about the freedom of speech of Palestinians and is listening to Palestine Solidarity Campaign on this, who think that this definition is being imposed on organisations around the world to try and silence Palestinian activists? Or is it that he's harbouring some weird hatred of Jews that he's had for all these decades but has never expressed? I mean, it's just completely implausible. That if you're looking for the best explanation is the guy cares about Palestinians.
Yeah, of course. And I don't know many people other than, again, Margaret Hodge, apparently, who thinks that Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite. I think that there's a legitimate case to be made that we didn't deal with some of the crank anti-Semitism that does exist on the left. There's a really interesting survey done a while ago by, I can't remember who it was. It was a Jewish organisation that looked at the extent of anti-Semitism across the spectrum from hard left to hard right. Obviously, it's the highest on the hard right and kind of decreases steadily until you get to kind of centrism, and carries on decreasing steadily as you get through to kind of left. And then there's a peak at the bottom when you come to hard left, which puts it about the same as like centre right. And I think, again, that comes down to the kind of crazy crank Zionist conspiracy theory stuff.
You know what they call that?
What?
The horseshoe theory.
Oh, really? Is that a thing? Have I just made myself look really stupid?
No, you haven't made yourself look really stupid. No, I'm saying that as in, like, that's the horseshoe theory is something that people on the far left always really argue against. Because the horseshoe theory is the idea that the far right and the far left are exactly the same.
It's more
because
like
they both want totalitarianism.
It's more like a kind of like a tiny.
Well, these are tiny cranks on both sides, right? So this isn't a horseshoe. There's sort of like 1,000 cranks on that side and 1,000 cranks on that side.
Well, even it goes more like that. It's like this. So there's actually a lot more, allegedly, according to the survey, anti-Semitism across the whole of the right than there is on most of the left. It just kind of goes down a little bit at the end.
Also, I think it's worth mentioning that although I think one should always condemn anti-Semitism in isolation, you don't have to bring other issues into it. But it is notable how little fuss is being made about Tory Islamophobia. That I can't think of a senior Tory apart from Saeed Abbasi who is condemning the inaction over Tory Islamophobia in the way that some Labour MPs obviously have been critical, sometimes justifiably, of the party's response. The delay in kicking Ken Livingstone out. And I think also the contrasting treatment by the media. That how much media coverage has been devoted to Tory Islamophobia in proportion to the number of cases and alleged offences you've seen.
And a lot of that, of course, is to do with the fact that there is no one else in the Tory party that is making it a big deal for other people in the Tory party. Can you imagine if Jacob Rees-Mogg founded his breakaway party on the basis that he was less Islamophobic than the Tory party? Oh my God. Wouldn't really stack up, would it? I think we're going to leave it there. The Love Island final is about to start.
It is, isn't it?
I
haven't actually watched it for the last 4. I watched the first 4 weeks. I found it really interesting as a cultural phenomenon. I got quite close to the characters. They brought in 5 new characters, and I was just
Have you not been watching it recently?
I can't bother to get to know them.
That makes me really sad.
I haven't watched the last 4 weeks.
But it's been so good.
Has it?
Yeah.
Oh well, we'll watch them when you can tell me all about it. You can fill me in.
When did you stop? Did you stop watching before they did the whole Prisoner's Dilemma, separate them into 2 houses thing?
I stopped watching after they reunited after Casa Amor.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Do you watch Love Island?
No, I'm going to be completely honest there. I haven't watched a second of it. No.
You're missing out, George. You really are.
Yeah, I've got all of August to
you
catch
should catch up.
So
It's on Netflix.
I think I'm gonna put the Chantal Mouffe to one side, and
I would definitely recommend it.
You've been working too hard with all this theory, George.
I know.
You need to put your feet up.
Yeah.
Enjoy some Love Island. Did you enjoy the World Cup?
I did actually. No, I did.
That's good.
Yeah.
So one of those things.
And actually, as Harold Wilson's remark still holds true, which is, have you noticed that England only win the World Cup under a Labour government? So that's...
It's true.
There we go. Southgate plus Jez, dream team.
That would be sweet.
I'd like to see Jez in a little, what they called.
Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
This was Tisky Sour. We'll be back in a week. As ever, if you want to make possible what we do, if you want to help us grow as an organisation, please go to support.novaramedia.com, make a monthly donation, subscribe to the YouTube, share it with your friends, and keep commenting. We love them. See you in a week's time.